Good morning. Today, what I'm going to do is show you how I proceed with my research. And this is perhaps for posterity, but partly it's to show skeptics that this is not just magical thinking, that I actually am a real researcher doing real research, even though I have never been academically trained in this. My training is in counseling, and I became a historical researcher and scholar by accident. Nonetheless, I think I've gotten fairly good at it, and I'm very careful to be rigorous in everything that I do. So we're going to proceed, and the way that this came about was that on eBay, a copy of the Portland Transcript, which I knew Matthew contributed to heavily much of his career, came on eBay for sale. It's the October 5th, 1839 edition. And of course, they give you visual copies that you can just barely read. But I was able to read enough of it to say, I think there's some of Matthew Franklin Whittier's work in this newspaper. And I was correct, and I bought it, and it's on the way. But this got me thinking, because the background for this is that, well, this was October 1839. Matthew and Abby had lost their first child, Joseph, to scarlet fever back in, I think it was August of 1838. This was a little bit after his newspaper, the Salisbury Monitor, had folded. They'd been persecuted, and it's a long story, but the gist of it is that they ended up in Portland, Maine, because his brother knew a fellow named Nathan Winslow, a fellow Quaker, who had a stove store, retail store. And Matthew got a job with that store. Very quickly, that business folded, and Matthew, with a partner, took it over. We don't need all of that except to say that Matthew and Abby are in Portland, Maine, where I am today, as of probably sometime in 1839, early 1839 or late 1838. Now, it occurred to me that on Google, in Google Books, you can find a digitized PDF copy of this year of the Portland Transcript, 1838, 1839. I hadn't paid too much attention to it because, for one thing, Matthew was running his newspaper, the Salisbury Monitor, from it was February through May of 1838. And I was unable to find anything reprinted from the Salisbury Monitor in that newspaper, the Portland Transcript. And I just assumed there wouldn't be anything in there, but I forgot that these yearly editions run from about April to April, from spring to spring, for reasons unknown, to me anyway, and that there would be some material that Matthew could have written while he and Abby were living in Portland. Now, they probably, as I have determined, have been in the rental house that I stood in front of. I don't have the date right in front of me as to which blog entry that was, but you can see the rather cold-looking fellow in the black cap standing in front of a house, I think, in the thumbnails, and that's the one. It would have been written in there, this material. And Abby was, toward the end of that year, was getting sick with tuberculosis, with consumption. He mentions in a letter that she's not at all well. That's in December of 1839. She apparently, right after that letter was written, probably December, right after Christmas maybe, she went to convalesce somewhere, probably Guadeloupe, with her first cousin, Charles Poyen, who introduced mesmerism or hypnosis to America. But earlier in 1839, they were recovering from the death of their son emotionally. But there was a window of happiness in there where Matthew was running the store. He had a job. He had some money. Abby was well. They were starting to recover from the death of their son. I had a past life flashback about that era, which I can't prove, and has one idiosyncratic detail that doesn't fit. But in that flashback, we were standing on kind of a high area in a crowd watching a rowboat race on the river or in the harbor. All of that is probably historically accurate. I think it came to me when I read about one. I saw an account of one and I said, wait a minute, and I had this memory. So we're standing, she's petite, so we're standing somewhere kind of high where we can see, where she can see. And she's enthralled with this race. She's totally absorbed in it, cheering on the ones that we want to win. And the emotion was very strong, and this is how I get past life memories that are fairly clear, cognitive ones, is if there's a strong emotion attached to it. So the emotion was that I was so grateful that she was completely distracted and completely happy and not worrying and not thinking about our loss, that for the moment she was happy. And looking at her and seeing her happy made me happy, see, because apparently it had been very tough for her. But I remember her wearing what I think they call a pill hat, a small white hat. Well, women in that era wore bonnets. Those things weren't invented, so far as I know, little hats, unless there was an exception, or she made it for herself, or it came from Paris because she was French, upper class French background. Maybe I'll find something, but that seems to be what I'd call a contraindication. So I put that memory kind of in the I don't know shelf, the I don't know category, the possible category. Anyway, that's some of the background. So I thought I'd better go back to this PDF of the 1838-1839 Portland Transcript, because I know that it pooches into 1839, and it would have been when they were living there. Well, lo and behold, I found some pieces. Now, this is how I determine whether something is or is not Matthew's work. If I find a pseudonym, and he used a whole bunch of them, this one is signed F with his middle initial for Franklin, and he did this throughout his career off and on. In the Dial, the first 2 years of the Dial, which is the Transcendentalist publication, there are reviews and essays, but mostly reviews, signed F. Those are Matthew's. Those are not Margaret Fuller's. Scholars have just assumed that the F stood for Fuller. They never looked more deeply into it, even though there's a contraindication there, and that is that she writes with no signature at all sometimes, which is the convention for an editor. But there's also these F-signed pieces. Well, it's not logical that she would demur from signing as the editor sometimes, and sometimes sign with her last initial. It doesn't make any sense. But then you go into it further, and you'll find that there's quite a bit of evidence that that's actually Matthew Franklin Whittier's work, being peripherally attached to the Transcendentalists as kind of the little brother of John Greenleaf Whittier and kind of the water boy. They gave him the book reviews, see, which is like the lowliest job on a journal. But he was so good that he made of them literature, and the literature is so good that it pumps up Margaret Fuller's reputation, see? So that's how that worked. Anyway, Matthew appears to have been signing as F in the Portland Transcript, and there's a couple more signatures that looked interesting. There was one, a column by the Bookworm, and I seem to recall that I had identified that tentatively as Matthew's many years later. And I read it in the eBay listing, and it's excerpts from somebody's reading. They come across something interesting and they throw it in there and so on. And I thought that might be Matthew. But then I went back into this PDF and found that this Bookworm column goes all the way back to when Matthew was publishing the Salisbury Monitor back in 1838. Very unlikely that that was his. So I kind of put that in the probably not folder. See? But then there was some other ones. There's a Mrs. Abdy, A-B-D-Y, which is not Abby. I don't know if that's historically identified, but that's not her. At one point, I began to wonder if that was her. It's not. And let's see, there's a couple other ones. There's an Addie, A-D-Y, who writes poetry. That's not Abby. But then there's an M asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Now, Matthew very rarely signed with his first initial. And there's something else signed with an M that's clearly not his in here. But Matthew used these asterisks to symbolize stars. A star was a soul, and therefore each star meant a soul. Now, if he still believed that he and Abby and their son Joseph were together as souls, all three of them, that's three fingers, then he could have signed M with his spiritual family, star, star, star. So at first I thought this was not his, and I was actually going to use it as an example of a decoy of something that was not. And then I got to reading them, and I thought, gosh, I think this could be Matthew, and I realized what the rationale could have been. So that's now officially in the I'm not sure category. And what I would have to do is go back through the entire paper, starting with the very first edition of 1838, and look for that signature and see if it shows up early in 1838. F does not, by the way, I've checked. Well, the very first F we'll see in a minute. It's clearly when they would have been in Portland already, like for maybe 3 or 4 months. So that's perfectly reasonable. The M star, 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 I'm not sure when that first shows up. That may be disproven. If it shows up right about at the point where Matthew was writing for the writing his own newspaper, the Salisbury Monitor, it's probably not him. If there's contraindications, like anything that wouldn't fit for Matthew, like My Three Sisters, anything like that that wouldn't fit for Matthew autobiographically, that would count that out. And this is the point I'm trying to make, is that my theories are disprovable. And this is what is required for a scientific theory. It has to be, quote, falsifiable is the term, which is kind of awkward term, but you have to be able to disprove it. If there's no possible way that it could ever be disproven, then, it becomes a delusional system. So my theories can be disproven. And in my blog, I have many times stuck my neck out in real time and said, I haven't looked at this. Let's look at it together. And I was very honest about that. Let's see where it takes us. Well, I'm going to do that today. I have looked through these F-sign pieces and read through them a little bit. I haven't read through them entirely. So far, it looks pretty clear that this is Matthew Franklin Whittier's work. But before I go into all of that, I'm going to start with something a little more whimsical to show you how my research progresses. And this is something that cannot be proven for sure. It's pretty darn close. But it'll show you how past life memory works, and it'll show you how my research works, and how I don't label something as absolutely 100% proven if it isn't, but I kind of give it a grade, a grade of plausibility from 0 to 100 or whatever. So when I was a boy, maybe 10 or 12 or younger than that even, my parents would take us all to, the three of us, because I'm an only child, would take us to a restaurant in Key Biscayne in Miami, Florida, called the English Pub, which was connected with the Jamaica Inn. I'll put a photograph of that up here on the screen. And it was a magical place. It was full of nautical antiques. It was designed to look and feel like an old English pub. And I was enchanted with the thing. Well, partly because I think I had a lifetime, in which I went to real English pubs in England. But the whole place was kind of magical. And I think that, as near as I can tell, there was a family that bought Key Biscayne. And one of the brothers really didn't want to be bothered with being an entrepreneur or being rich or anything like that. He was kind of, he had hobbies and, so he apparently had a hobby of collecting old nautical antiques. And I would guess that his family put pressure on him to have a business. And he said, all right, if I have to have a business, I'll have a restaurant. So he, having apparently read about the Jamaica Inn and loving English pubs, which he probably went back and forth collecting these antiques and went to English pubs, he created a restaurant. And it was like the Jamaica Inn was for the rich people, and attached to it, the English pub was for everybody else. And it was like it was a place to put his antiques. This is what I've extrapolated, and it probably didn't make much money because it was all full of booths, If you've been to the Cracker Barrel, they have it ergonomically, figured out to get the absolute maximum people packed in there to get the biggest bang for the buck, I think. Then they got the store and everything. This guy was the opposite. He wanted a fun place to put his antiques in, a place that was like an English pub. So he had booths. You could only fit one family or one person in a booth. And he had the bar and everything. Richard Nixon and B.B. Rebozo went to this place, all things. But anyway, when I was a kid, I loved to see this picture hanging in the bathroom. They had the urinals, the stand-up, full-length urinals, and you'd go for the men, and you'd go in there and you'd stand, and up over on the wall was this painting, a reproduction of a painting of dogs peeing on a wall, okay? Well, it turns out this is from The Dirty Dogs of Paris by Boris O'Klein. He did a whole series of them in the 1930s. I didn't know that when I was a kid. On the bottom, it has a little printed notice that says you can reorder copies. Well, I desperately wanted to reorder a copy when I was a kid, and it never happened. I don't know why, but it never happened. I never could afford it. My parents didn't get it for me, but I always wanted one. Well, look what I found on eBay some years ago. This is not one of the reproductions. This is the actual thing that I looked at when I was a boy. This is the one that sat up over the urinals. And Hurricane Andrew apparently destroyed that restaurant and they tore it down. And some things were saved. Hopefully the antiques were saved. I don't know. I bought that. It was $80, and when I told the lady I remembered it from my childhood, she cut it in half with the caveat that I must not sell it. And I told her I wouldn't sell it unless I was in dire need. Well, I'm not in dire need yet. So, but then in my research with Matthew, I began to find somewhat similar things that showed me why I would have loved this thing, because I was just fascinated by it, you know. Well, this wasn't the first time that I had been fascinated by anthropomorphic dogs. This is the carpet bag of May 3rd, 1851. I've got it in my notes. And on the 5th page is this drawing. And it's attached to an unsigned article. This is a case where the dogs of Boston are having a meeting to protest the collar law. You know, it's called an indignation meeting extraordinary, the law triumphant. That's what the title under the cartoon says. It's called indignation meeting. I don't need to go into this too far. The point is that Matthew reported meetings as well as talks as part of his bread and butter as a reporter. And he would get bored in these things and he would make of them, they became fodder for satires. Well, look at the dog taking notes. That is Matthew. Apparently the artist was in on the joke and knew who was writing this. And that's Matthew portrayed as the dog taking notes in this meeting, just like he did for a living. Put that back up there for now. But that's not where it started, because I'm sure that's Matthew's, by the way, by style. At the time, I felt it was, but I couldn't prove it because it was unsigned. But now I've got so much circumstantial evidence for style. And Matthew also wrote a similar thing for the Daily Delta when he was in New Orleans undercover writing for that paper. And then he wrote for the New York Constellation much earlier than that about the mistreatment of dogs and that they had a meeting, you know. So he would use the several times over, he would use this premise of the dogs having a meeting, but he used it also for serious things, like the dogs were being killed. There was a bounty on dogs that could be killed any way anybody wanted to kill them to try to get rid of rabies in New York City. And the boys would just be very cruel to these stray dogs, see? And Matthew thought it was awful because he was very sensitive about animal rights, you know, which was unusual back then. Anyway, there's a long history, and it's obvious that's Matthew's. But here in Yankee Doodle, which is the first humorous magazine in America, 1846, 1847, we have mass meeting of apple women reported for the New York Lightning Bug. And above it, this is Matthew's work also, and above it, this is a reprint, we have a drawing of the apple women. It's quite humorous. And if you'll note the reporter, this just hit me intuitively when I looked at it. I said, you've made the reporter look like a dog. This is what I think Matthew told them. You've made me look like a dog. Well, he must have shown this to the artist at the carpet bag, see, or who did the carpet bag's work, and said, as long as they're going to make me look like a dog, let's make me look like a better looking dog, you know? So this history goes back. As a 10 or 12-year-old boy, the reason I was so enthralled by the Dirty Dogs of Paris is that subconsciously I remembered these other ones. See? So this is extrapolation to a point. can't prove these things outright. So this is something I would say is like 85, 90% definite in my world, not in yours, because you as a skeptic, you may be fighting this. So in your world, it's down to zero. See, but that's not rational. You're letting your prejudices affect you. So now what we're going to do is to look at, basically for the first time, I'm going to be looking at this with you, these pieces in the transcript. And golly gee, let's see, did I write down the dates? I've got them here, I think. Because I was going to use my acquaintance Ken's laptop, the XP machine that I used before when I wanted to read PDFs and still record here, because I can't do both on the same machine. And like poor Ken, the machine itself died. But that was actually a good thing, which of course I mean the machine and not Ken, because I remembered that I can do this on my Kindle, which is like way, way easier. This is one, used to be some kid's Kindle that I bought in Salvation Army for $20. Everything is done on the cheap here because people won't buy my books. So I find a way around it. By the way, the professor culling in the websites for these universities is going very well. I've now hit about 300 people. I've recorded 300 emails that I'm going to send when my article comes out. It's supposed to come out tomorrow, Monday the 15th, in Real Paranormal Magazine UK. And then I have to wait a month before I post it on Academia EDU. And then I start sending out emails. Each one will have a little personalized paragraph that has to do with their special area of specialty. And we'll see. There's, as I mentioned in my written blog, I've sent a few emails to people that had some kind of peripheral interest that wasn't directly related to this paper or the other major authors that I'll be writing about. And I haven't gotten a single response. I think out of maybe 5 or 6 or 7 emails that I've sent. And I'm talking sitting down for half an hour and composing an email and sending them examples and everything else. And they're on target examples, very like somebody's into plagiarism or somebody's into, the Underground Railroad or, something like that that's very specifically targeted. And I'll send them an introduction about who Matthew Franklin Whittier was and what he did along those lines, how he was plagiarized or how he was, working with the Underground Railroad or working with William Lloyd Garrison, or how he apparently knew Frederick Douglass. These people, like one of them is totally into Frederick Douglass. And I don't get a reply, not even a polite reply, Well, it's still early, it might be a couple weeks yet. They might not be looking at their emails, because of COVID-19. Who knows? I don't know. But it's very strange that I don't even get an answer. It makes me run scenarios, weird scenarios. Like I've been subtitling this Matthew Franklin Whittier. Has somebody said, anything titled Matthew Franklin Whittier, don't open it because it's got virus, Or, I don't know. If it's not from a student, they won't open it. All kinds of scenarios, but I really have no idea. They're not, I don't believe that they're rude people inherently, Anyway, this is in the February 9th, 1839 edition of the Portland Transcript. I'll put the opening up on the screen. And this is signed F. And it's written for the transcript, which just means it's original. And it's called The Dying Minstrel. Now, usually Matthew's poetry was either it was autobiographical or it was directed at somebody. I'm not sure in what sense this is autobiographical, if it is. It wouldn't have been because Abby was dying. He would never have written such a thing. But I think Abby was healthy at this time, relatively. See, I don't think she had come down with the symptoms of tuberculosis or consumption at this time. They'd lost their child. And I think, here's my guess, is that Matthew felt old after losing this child, and that he identified with a dying minstrel. But let's see. This is going to be a little lengthy, but this is research. I want to read the whole thing because what I'm looking for is indications or contraindications. I want to see anything that I know, after 11 years of research and having found and digitized 2,300 plus of Matthew Franklin Whittier's works, I know what to look for. I know his favorite expressions, his style, and I also know what would preclude him being the author. So I'm looking for either of those things. So I have to read the whole thing because this is real-time research. The minstrel's hour was come, and on his couch the dying man lay stretched in calm repose. His aged form wasted and shrunk, ill seemed fit tenement wherein no pure a soul as his might dwell. His high-arched brow, which still borne signs it had been noble, though old age had ploughed it deeply, and stern time had swept youth's freshness from it, was richly mantled by the reverend locks which loosely flung their covering o'er it, and his fading eye, which erst had brightly flashed, lit up by flame of high-souled inspirations, now was closed. Now that would be a typical depiction of Matthew in old age. And I will put up the etching we have of Matthew on the screen so you can see. Around him friends were gathered, gazing on in silent sadness there, nor e'en a groan, nor word, nor sigh, nor breath was heard to break the solemn hush of stillness, and it seemed as if the parting soul close commune held with the ethereal world, was e'en then foretasting of its holy joys and bliss. So calm the minstrel lay. Now, of course, Matthew believed in heaven and the astral world. Notice he calls it the ethereal world. That's not just slang for heaven. Matthew, with Abby, had studied esoteric teachings. But soon the sun, laving in gold the hilltops of the west, gave signal of departing day, and then, as if some seraph note from yon bright world, some melody from heaven had struck his ear and woke the memory of other days. And note that he believes in the preexistence of the soul, so he's speaking of that. The harper roused him, and with voice still smooth, though faint and feeble, called to those around, "Oh, bring my harp, my tried and faithful harp, that I may sweep its long, L-E-V-E-D, leved chords once more, ere yet I die." 'Twas quickly brought, and then, as nerved by some unseen yet mighty power, his thin pale finger o'er its strings he flung, and touched its thrilling chords with that same skill, that magic skill with which in younger time he woke the swell of witching melody, and held the listener's ear and soul enchained. Now Matthew, as I know from other references, was deeply affected by music and a very sensitive person. Abby apparently played the harp. So all of these things fit. And thus he sang. Here we have his song. I have dreamed, far away in the realms of yon starry sphere. Now I've said that Matthew would often bring in the stars where Abby was concerned because she loved the stars, where night comes not, but a golden day shines constantly brilliant and clear. I have wandered free as a bird of air through the joy-dressed fields of that world so far. I have dreamed. Now this sounds like Abby. It almost makes me think that she wrote the poem, because we've seen that she starts with this double exclamation in her poetry, and she's the one that loves the stars. She plays the harp, and she is the one that has studied the astral realm more than Matthew and experienced it to some degree, I think, because she was psychic. So this almost sounds like she wrote the poetry. As the seraphs fanned their harps and stirred the sweet-toned wires in holy sound, enchanted and fixed, I lingered to hear those heavenly strains which burst on my ear. I have dreamed, and have seen bright angels hovering o'er me, arrayed in robes of such gorgeous sheen as mortals never saw before me. Though dazzled, I gazed on those robes of light, and trembled with awe at a scene so bright. This type is broken up, it's hard to read. An angel spoke, and I bowed me down at the sight of his godlike voice. He held in his hand a golden, I can't read that, and he said, "O mortal, rejoice. Thy troubles are Can't read that either. And soon we shall, I think it says, bring thy soul to its home, to its God and King. So he says, thus, methought, the angel spoke. And was I only dreaming? Yet now my blissful slumbers broke, still heaven is on me beaming. And now, my long-loved harp, adieu, thy aged friend is dying. His lengthened course on earth is through, to other realms he's highing. The sun o'er the hills of the west his mild pale beams is throwing, and I, like him, must seek my rest, to the world of spirits going. In life's dark wiles, to thee alone to cheer my paths was given, and now my soul, with thy last tone, would wing its way. It's a line. The minstrel ceased, the trembling harp strings hushed their soft and gentle tones. With that last tone, his soul had sped its way to heaven. Signed F. I'm saying that's Matthew Franklin Whittier, and I'm also saying that Abby contributed the poem. But the irony is that in a few short months, Abby would be dying of consumption, and she would be gone by the end of March, March 1841. So it's quite ironic in that sense. The next we're going to do is March 2nd, 1839. So that was February. This is now the following March. And this is a story, and a somewhat lengthy story. And we are going to go ahead and read it again because this is research. This is called The Star of Love. And I meant to look this up before I started, but there is a piece which Francis Durivage stole from Matthew Franklin Whittier from his portfolio. And I've explained many times how this happened, but apparently he and George Burnham approached Matthew in 1848 and tricked him into signing a contract that let them publish everything from his portfolio of unpublished work going all the way back to 1830. Matthew wrote a lot of adventure stories, just about all, with at least one exception. Those adventure stories ended up being published, most of them in Gleason's Pictorial, under Francis Durivage's name. One of them was given to George Burnham. So now we have to believe that George Burnham had every bit as much skill in writing these foreign adventure stories, which is bullshit. It's just that George said, I want some of these, and he gave him one or two, which blew their cover completely, see? But anyway, when you get into Gleason's Pictorial and you find these wonderful foreign adventure stories signed Francis Durivage, with possibly one or two exceptions, these are all written by Matthew Franklin Whittier. None of that was, and Durivage got an editorship on Ballew's Pictorial, the successor to Gleason's Pictorial, on the basis of that work. See? A very nice job. I'm sure they paid quite well. But this one is called The Star of Love, and that one has a very similar title. I'll have to look it up. If I find it, I'll put it up on the screen here. So I'm going to read this, and we're going to look for, I'm going to break off anytime I see an indication or a contraindication. And I don't care how long this is, because this is research, this is for the future. I want people to see that I'm doing real research, okay? So I'm going to read this and stop anytime I notice something, which is not optimal for getting into a story, but the setting sun had just veiled his brilliant face behind the hills, and a gorgeous belt of yellow light encircled the whole western horizon, interspersed with small dark clouds which added rich beauty to the heavens and seemed like islands in a golden sea. It was one of the loveliest of summer's lovely evenings, and gentle zephyrs, winds, scents, had arisen to fan away the heat which the sun had left behind him, and to refresh and invigorate the weary world after the fatigues of the day. That is a right down the line, typical, rich, nature appreciating introduction. You'll see many of those. If you get into Gleason's Pictorial, which you can find online in PDF, and you look for Francis Durivage, you can search on his name if you find it, say, in archive.org. And you read the introductions, you will find introductions that sound just like that. Now, he's not the only one that introduced a story that way, but I'm telling you, this is smack on typical of Matthew. This is also signed F, by the way. It was at this hour that Charles Dermont and Maria Langdon walked forth to enjoy the cooling breeze and to admire the beauties of nature and the works of the Creator as exhibited, quote, in the heavens above and upon the earth beneath. I don't know where that quote comes from. They were both young, and she was fair and beautiful as, quote, the fairest daughter of our mother Eve. And now there's a quote set off. She was a form of light, once seen, became a part of sight. Now, I'll find where that comes from, too. I'm guessing Byron or Shelley or Shakespeare. Those three are the most common that Matthew used, but he went to a lot of different sources. I know that Matthew and Abby loved to walk out in nature, especially at night and in the evening. Now, when is this? This is in the evening, a summer's evening. So this is autobiographical. Matthew is thinking back to their courtship when they would go take a walk in the evening. Not that they're the only people in the world, only couple in the world that ever took walks in the evening, but we have two hits here. And he, though he might not have been called handsome in the usual acceptance of the term, yet possessed a nobleness in his appearance, which failed not to attract the notice of the most casual observer, mingled with a mildness of expression, which was no less sure to please. Now, this is Matthew speaking of himself. He's not so vain as to say that he's handsome, especially because he's quite sensitive about his long nose, which he makes fun of and indicates that it's the bane of his existence. But Abby still loves him, even though he has this long nose. That's the way he feels about it. But he has to admit there's a certain nobility to his countenance. If you've watched my entry a couple, 3 entries ago, where I talked about my reading with Candace Zellner in 2010, the very first thing she came out with, having seen Matthew's engraving, was nobility, stature, status. See, that's the way she perceived him, not knowing anything about him. So that's another hit. Such were these two whose hearts love had united by her fairy web, whose tender affections were centered in each other, and whose cup of happiness seemed filled when their souls could hold sweet communion together, undisturbed by the presence of others. Now, here's the situation. Matthew was living and working in New York City, but he would come for harvest time and holidays and other times, and he would visit with Abby, and they were permitted, even when she was young, like 15 apparently, so long as he behaved himself, they were permitted to go on these evening and nighttime walks together. And there they could speak freely, of their love for each other and of nature and of mysticism. And Candace talked about how they would read black market metaphysical books together, and she would hide them under her dress, see when somebody was coming. So this is all part of the same thing. They can speak freely now. They had unconsciously wandered a great distance. Now, I haven't read any of this, by the way. They had unconsciously wandered to a great distance, forgetting, in the rich enjoyment of free conversation, that every step took them farther from their homes, and scarcely realizing that they stepped at all, until at length they found themselves wearied by the walk, when they sat them down to rest a while upon the verdant grass, by the side of a crystal fountain, which bubbled up, with clear transparency, and was now reflecting in its glassy depths the light of the star Venus, which was twinkling brightly in the heavens. This fountain, my dear Maria, said Charles, appears to me to be a true representation of the internal fountain of love, ever flowing, pure and unalloyed. It is an eternal spring which can never fail. So see, Abby has taught Matthew mysticism, and he was already a Quaker, so he was already exposed to mysticism. His mother's was on the superstitious side, apparently, although what he might have picked up in books is another matter. He would have read George Fox and John Woolman and so on. So he immediately associates to mysticism, to a fountain of love, capital L, within. And she says, and to me, replied Maria, that star which you see in its depths is an emblem of the constancy of love, at least of that which I bear towards you. It is ever a faithful attendant upon its Lord and Master, the sun, and can never be separated far from him. Perhaps this is the reason for its name. You, Charles, are the sun, and I the star. Now, is that beautiful? That's Abby's conception of her relationship to Matthew, see? Most truly so, returned he, implanting a kiss upon her soft and lily hand. But you must recollect that the sun is sometimes eclipsed, and his brightness is hidden. Eclipsed to the world, answered she, but not to the star. I've never read this before. He is ever bright to Venus, though he may for a moment hide his glory from the inhabitants of earth, and even then his bride may be found near him. You understand the symbolism of this. This applies to me and Abby now, by the way, every bit as much. Oh, these are rich, heaven-born expressions, exclaimed Charles, and in a moment, thoughtfully and slowly added, think you, Maria, you could love me still, though to the eyes of the world the mantle of darkness should be thrown over my character, though my fair fame should be eclipsed, though what is now bright should become dark and shaded? What mean you, Charles? For heaven's sake, what mean these ominous words, that downcast countenance? Love you, can you doubt me? Never, dearest Maria, never. But see, the moon is rising. Is it not best that we should return? Another time I will tell you all. So there's some dark secret he's hiding. And I have gotten from other sources that there were certain things that he hadn't told her, and he was terrified that if he told her, she wouldn't love him. So I think that's going to be the theme of this. And I'm not going to say what those things are that I think they were. It's not necessary to go into that. But I have a gut feeling I know what this is about. The parents of Maria had been already somewhat alarmed at her long absence, and when she appeared before them with a dejected countenance and a livid paleness upon her cheeks, their alarm was increased. Their kind affection at once discovered that some unusual occurrence had taken place to depress her spirits and cast a gloom over her mind. Her wonted vivacity had given place to sad silence, and her eye was drooping and seemed struggling to suppress the outbursting of the tears which were flowing at her heart. Now, if this is autobiographical, this revelation would have occurred much earlier, back when they were courting, and not when this was written. So this is, he would have returned her to her parents' house in East Haverhill. My dear Maria, said the mother, you are deathly pale and seem very ill. No, mother, I am not ill. My long walk has fatigued me, and I need rest, replied the daughter, and soon after, in the most intense agony of feeling, she sought her couch. But she found not rest. The dark mystery occasioned by the words of Charles hung over her spirit and burdened her soul with bitter anguish. Doubts and fears thronged upon her mind, and her breast was tossed by unutterable emotions. She loved, but whom did she love? She longed for and yet feared the unfolding and revealment of the mystery. This is Victorian literature, by the way. His answer, another time I will tell you all, was continually ringing in her ears with the tone of a death knell. Sleep fled before its awful sound, and during that night, Maria Levere, that's interesting, I wonder if Levere is a French name, I bet it is, had no happier feeling than the dreadful agony of suspense. Charles Dermont had been left an orphan about 5 years before the time of which we have been speaking. Now, this is interesting because we're probably talking about 1831 or 32. Matthew ran away from home at age 12 in 1825. He may have come back for a year or two, maybe to work as a shoemaker with his brother in East Haverhill, but he left home for good at age 14. So in 32, Matthew is 16 and 17. We're talking about age 17, maybe 16 or 17. And he had left home at age 12, which is 4 or 5 years earlier. So I think when he says that Charles was orphaned about 5 years before, he means that he left home, ran away from home about 5 years before. Matthew wrote very heavily about his own life. This is very much autobiographical. His style of writing is to take his own life, and then I call it putting it through the Photoshop filters, the filter that makes it look like charcoal or makes it look like acrylic or anything. He puts his own life through the filters in Photoshop, and it comes out as these stories. And his parents had bequeathed to him none of this world's goods, for they possessed of but few, although Matthew actually did get a portion of the sale from the family farm. But he had what is much better, a good education, which Abby had given Matthew in reality, a generous heart, a noble disposition, and an upright character. He had devoted himself to the study of the law, and immediately after obtaining his profession, had established himself in the lovely New England village of Padua, which I'm not familiar with, where he first saw and loved Maria Levere, which love was fully returned by her. So he's just created a character. 4 years had passed since he undertook the practice of law, and he had succeeded beyond even his most sanguine expectations, and his fame was unspotted with the world, and high hopes were entertained of his future eminence. He was one of those who carry with themselves the esteem and goodwill of all who know them. It unfortunately happened that a short time after he became the accepted lover of, quote, the Queen of Padua, for she was so called. Remember, Abby's reading this over his shoulder. The rage for speculation in land arrived at its maddest point, and Charles, partaking a little of the mania, and hoping by one successful effort to gain for himself a respectable property, whereby he might be able to live happily, and in independence with the lady of his love, borrowed privately of a friend a large amount of money, which he expended in land, which he could not afterwards dispose of as he had anticipated. Alas, for Charles, but happily for many others, reason, the bitter foe of all mania for speculation, began at this time again to dawn upon this part of the world, and men began to look at the consequences before they plunged into the whirling vortex. Now, Matthew had tried to enter the world of mercantile trading as a way to increase his fortune so that he could ask for Abby's hand in marriage. The book, The Perils of Pearl Street, which scholars believe was written by Asa Green, was actually written by Matthew, drawing on that experience of working in that field in New York City, and he had failed. So this is roughly autobiographical. The purchase, therefore, remained upon his hands, and the time was rapidly drawing nigh when the sum would be due, and he had no means of liquidating the debt. It was this fact which was piercing like an arrow to his very soul, and which he was to unfold to Maria, quote, at another time, or at, quote, another time. Now, Matthew had written eloquently against debtors' prison in this same series of 5 books written from 1833 to 1834, which scholars mistakenly attribute to Asa Green, because Asa Green was Matthew's editor, or had been his editor on the New York Constellation, and Asa Green is in a couple of those books as the man that got the trademark or copyright for them, registered them, but his name is nowhere on them. One of those books is called The Debtors' Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier. It's a beautiful little novel written to try to bring public attention to the evils of debtors' prison. And so we know that Matthew feels strongly about this. But alas, Charles himself knew not the worst. He had received from his friend a check, drawn as he supposed by another individual, and which upon presentation to the bank was instantly paid, but was at last discovered to be a forgery. And as Charles had received the amount from the teller, he was arrested and conveyed to prison as guilty of the crime on that very night when Maria was tossing in bitterness on her restless couch. With the first dawnings of the morning spread the appalling news of the imprisonment of Charles Dermont on the charge of having committed forgery to a large amount. And to the Queen of Padua, the awful mystery seemed cleared up and the dark riddle solved. Those boding words which he had uttered on the evening before appeared to leave no room for doubt of his guilt, yet they were first locked in the arcana of her own breast, and despite of such strong conviction so irresistibly forced upon her judgment, hope would at times draw upon her soul. For truly indeed, and here's a set-off quote, the miserable have no other medicine but only hope. I'll look that up as well. And at such moments, she felt almost assured that he was guiltless. Now, this theme of doubting each other, it came up in Candace Zellner's reading, where she says there was some trouble in the marriage, mostly from outside sources, and I identified that as jealousy. There was also this question, which is very much akin to jealousy, of doubting the other. And the question, the whole theme is, do you retain your love and faith in your partner, even though everything looks wrong. See? So that's the theme of this story. And it was something they had struggled with at various times. The people of the village loudly proclaimed their firm belief in his innocence, though they were compelled to acknowledge that circumstances were dark against him. I will just say that I have struggled with this myself with Abby, because I can't see her. First of all, is this real? Is Abby real? And secondly, is she really the person that I take her to be? And any long distance relationship, people tend to go through these struggles every once in a while. They might find some reference online and it doesn't look so good about the person. And, so I've gone through this myself. This is left over from Matthew and Abby having struggled with that. And that goes back to past lifetimes, way back, because what Abby has explained to me is that soulmates have hurt each other terribly. They're wide open, vulnerable to each other because they've become much more intimate psychically than most couples. Even longtime married couples, soulmates are very open, like an open book to each other. They're telepathic with each other. But they've also, in the past lives, they've hurt each other terribly. See, so these emotions remain and they struggle with this stuff. Charles, meanwhile, was quite calm, asserted his entire guiltlessness of the charge, expressed himself willing to await his trial and to abide by the decision of the court. But his good nature and generous disposition would not allow him to betray his friend, whom he now suspected of having committed the crime, in order to confer a favor upon himself, and with the expectation that the sum would be speedily paid and the forgery never discovered. Now, this is interesting. I have said that the reason Matthew Franklin Whittier did not come forward publicly to charge Edgar Allan Poe with having stolen the raven or having falsely claimed the raven was because he was doing this undercover anti-slavery work. He dared not come forward because it could expose people working in the Underground Railroad, because the lawyer would keep asking, what's this connection and how can you prove that you've done writing and who can verify, and, this stuff would start to come out. So he was very highly principled, and he would not save himself if it would hurt somebody else. So this is just a small indication that he did have those kind of sensibilities. Soon after his arrest, Charles wrote a note to Maria declaring his innocence, reminding her of the conversation of the previous evening, begging her not to misconstrue it, and then gently adding, "Thy sun is now eclipsed. Will the star of love still shine near him?" Upon the reception of this letter, she hesitated not. She believed his assertion, and quickly that star was shining by its, quote, Lord and Master in the dark walls of the prison. She had flown to offer her consolation and to share with him in his weighty sufferings. To her he unfolded all, his imprudence, but at the same time his freedom from all crime. She strove to remember his hours as free from pain. She strove to render his hours as free from pain and as pleasant as the cell of the prison would permit. And surely with her, as he afterwards said, be where he might, he could not but be happy, and time sped rapidly away until at length the day arrived on which he was to take his trial and have his fate decided. Now, we're pretty sure that the trial's going to go against him, but let's continue. With the almost breathless Maria, who could not be prevailed upon to leave him, even though he requested it, hanging upon his arm, he was ushered by the officer into the presence of the court. And he who, at that time, at that same legal bar, had so often, so eloquently, and so feelingly pled for unhappy prisoners, was now standing in the culprit's box, a prisoner himself. Among the vast crowd assembled on the occasion, when this couple entered, not an eye was free from tears, not a heart untouched, nor a breast but was filled with compassion. Charles, though in truth somewhat agitated, yet appeared perfectly composed, and strove to calm the perturbation of the nearly fainting Maria. This is also autobiographical. There are many references to the fact that whatever turmoil was going on in Matthew's heart, he kept a cool appearance. He hid his emotions. I've mentioned that many times. We've just got one more reference. A deep silence pervaded the hall of justice when the indictment was read against the prisoner. But when he responded thereto not guilty, A spontaneous, irrepressible exclamation of joy burst from the lips of the crowd, as if they wished and believed it true. The trial proceeded, and the testimony grew stronger and stronger against the unhappy man. The privacy of the transaction regarding the purchase and the fact of having offered the check at the bank were powerful circumstantial evidence of his guilt, and although he asserted that he had borrowed the amount, yet from withholding the name of the lender, his assertion operated to his disadvantage rather than in his favor. The evidence being concluded, Charles was called upon for his defense. He rose and amid a death-like stillness made a most eloquent appeal to the jury, admitted the strength of the testimony against him, but declared himself nevertheless innocent and expressed his determination to suffer the penalty, if necessary, rather than betray the friend who, he had no doubt, had supposed that the amount would have been long before paid and the forgery remained forever a secret. His address unsealed the fountains of every heart, and tears of pure compassion and mercy flowed copiously. I think that's supposed to be, it's mistyped. When he had finished, and the usual ceremonies of the court were performed, the jury retired to decide upon the fate of the prisoner. Oh, what bitter moments of awful suspense were those of their deliberation to Charles and Maria, and indeed to all assembled. Deep gloom settled upon every countenance, for all believed him free from guilt, and yet all were, up to the top of the page, forced to believe that the evidence was sufficient to convict him. It was not long before the jurors returned, with downcast eyes and sorrowful aspect, as if reluctant to fulfill the duty imposed upon them by their oaths. Every one could read their verdict in their appearance, but when from the lips of the foreman fell the awful declaration, "Guilty," for a moment every pulse stopped its beating, and every breath was drawn. The poor Maria fell senseless upon the floor, from whence she was immediately raised in the arms of Charles. The next instant the judge arose from his seat and proclaimed calmly, loudly, and distinctly, "He is not guilty. This right hand hath offended. Let him be free. I will await the penalty." Awestruck and astonished, all gazed upon him as if in doubt with regard to the sanity of his mind, but he soon satisfied all their misgivings by going to the culprit's desk, taking Charles by the hand and saying, "You are noble and generous. I will be just. You would have suffered in my stead, but it shall not be. Take home thy fainting charge. She shall never see her guiltless Charles condemned to imprisonment. The law shall not be deprived of its victim. I will await the reward of my crime." The judge then surrendered himself into the hands of the confounded and amazed people. That caught me totally by surprise, which, since I wrote it, is odd, but that's the truth. I'll honestly report to you that I had no I had no idea that that was going to be the surprise twist ending of this. So the judge was the culprit, and he turned himself. It's beautiful. This is top-notch Victorian drama. This is every bit as good as anything that Charles Dickens ever wrote. I'm telling you. And people go by reputation; they don't go by quality. So people would scoff at that, but present this to somebody as a long-lost piece of Charles Dickens' work, and they would go wild over it. I'm telling you. All right. The judge was, at his own request, conveyed to prison and Charles released. Amid the heartfelt congratulation of friends, the two lovers were escorted to her home, where, after a few days, Maria recovered her former beauty. Her faded eye again became bright, and her wasted form soon regained its wonted grace and symmetry. A vacancy being occasioned by the crime of the judge, Charles was selected to fill his place, and thus he who had been prisoner was made judge, while the former judge was made the prisoner. So various is fortune. Charles refused to preside in the trial of his friend, who by another magistrate was sentenced to a few months' imprisonment, during which time the new-made judge frequently visited him together with his bride, who had shortly after his release changed her single name to that of Mrs. Maria Dermont, which she yet retains. And never do Charles or she gaze upon the, quote, star of love without feelings of holy reverence and unbounded bliss, and they take great delight in relating their story and pointing out the fountain where they had pledged their mutual vows and seen that star reflected in its crystal waters, signed F. Okay, so by my lights, according to the way I do my research, this is absolutely confirmed as Matthew Franklin Whittier's work. The only thing which would convince me otherwise is if I found another F-sign piece which strongly works against that. If I find one in here not attributed to the Salisbury Monitor during the months that the Monitor was being published, if I find one that's cruel to animals or pro-slavery, rather, if I find one that talks about how he had a girl on the side, there's any number of things that could preclude it. But if there are no further contraindications, absolutely check that is Matthew Franklin Whittier signing as F in 1839 in the Portland Transcript. So you see how I work. Now, when I say that I've identified 2,300 of Matthew's works, I put them all through this process, all 2,300 of them. And then there's a whole other batch that I consider possible, which I put in a separate folder called POS MFW for each publication. I have another little folder of things that I absolutely wasn't sure about. And sometimes, as I learn things, I move them over to the definite folder. But this is important because I established that something was actually written by Matthew and not by Margaret Fuller, for example, based on other things, In other words, I have a whole bunch of pieces that were signed with a star that I say are Matthew's, so that Margaret Fuller's supposed work in the New York Tribune, which is signed with a star, I say that that's Matthew's because he has used this pseudonym many times before. But how do I know that? I know that because I put that whole pseudonym through this process. We're talking, 200-300 pieces signed with a star. I put all of them through this process, see? And therefore, I can definitely say that Matthew Franklin Whittier used a single asterisk as a signature for many, many years. So each one is built on the other one, and that one is built on another one. And it looks like it's all a big house of cards. It's just maybe a delusional system that's, I've created. It's not. It's all based on real research. So this is an important point. Okay, so that was the story in the March 2nd, 1839 edition. Abby would die of consumption about 2 years after this. Now we're going to go to the March 23rd, 1839 edition. We have another piece signed F. And anybody can fast forward or click through these things as they see fit. Again, this is for posterity, however grandiose that is of me. There will come a time, I think, when quite a few people will be interested in how I did my research. When it's really understood that in this past life that Matthew was the real author of The Raven and the real co-author of A Christmas Carol and some other things. When people really take this seriously and they understand that that's actually correct, they'll be a lot more interested in this. So here we have, for the transcript, which means that it's original, a poem called Consolation. This is a rather sad poem by the looks of it. But we'll go through it just like we did these others. And there's a couple more to go through with a different pseudonym, and then we're done. Now, this opening reminds me very much of some of Matthew's other poems. I can't remember exactly which ones. Oh, what in a world like this is found when the once free heart is by sorrow bound, when the brightest joys have changed to gloom and memory lingers at the tomb, when the fondest hopes lie buried there and pleasures of youth have turned to care. Oh, what is found in a world like this to raise the soul to its former bliss? I remember it's the one, in much wisdom is much grief, which I've read to you a few entries previous, where he talks about living in a garret, alone and high, or something like that. I think it's a very similar meter, and it's not the only one. So Matthew has written in precisely this meter in this style. Though ye light with smiles the drooping eye, the tear of sadness will linger nigh. Though mirthful words from your lips may roll, they cannot reach to a wounded soul. Though the festal strain be loudly sung, 'twill strike an ear for its notes unstrung. But friendship's voice has a stronger power to cheer the heart in its gloomy hour. than the sweetest draughts false joy can bring from the shallowy source of pleasure's spring. And nature, too, with a soothing voice, bids the sorrowing soul again rejoice, in darkest moods or in fairest forms, in sunny smiles or in fiercest storms. She holdeth alike a mystic charm, the saddest fears of the breast to calm. For the wildest blasts which sweep the earth waft softer sounds than the sounds of mirth. The rolling waves of the bounding sea, as they onward rush, unchained and free, bear lighter tones to the heavy heart than gayest notes of the minstrel's art. They tell of the hour when, hushed to rest, the shadows played o'er their peaceful breast, when no tempest dared to rough their face or wrap their form in its wild embrace, but a zephyr fanned the giant deep as he silent lay in the arms of sleep. They tell of this, and in tones of love proclaim that the winds must cease to move, that the King of Peace will soon again return to quiet the tossing main. And they bid the soul to stay its fears, and the eye to quench its flowing tears. For this King of Peace can hush to rest the wildest waves of the human breast. Signed, F. This is Matthew in grief for his son, Joseph, I would say, because, it's only been like less than half a year since his precious son died of scarlet fever. And he is resorting to nature, to the ocean, and he is likening the ocean's moods to his own moods inside, and he is appealing to Jesus, the King of Peace. So this is a deeply religious man. This is someone who loves nature. This is someone who has had a terrible loss. So once again, this is Matthew, and again, he's in grief for his son Joseph. So that's a definite check. I mean, we don't have any question now. I didn't have much question when I started this. Having read these, I have no question whatsoever. Now we have, however, one that I initially, intellectually, thought was probably, these are signed M******. I've never seen him use this before, but I have seen him and Abby sign a couple years earlier in Dover, New Hampshire for the Dover Inquirer as Kappa, Lambda, and Mu. This was before Joseph was born. Kappa means a Japanese water sprite, river sprite. That stood for Abby. Lambda is another reference to Matthew hiding his feelings because the symbol lambda used to be used on Spartan shields. And Mu was their unborn son when they first started the series, Joseph. So I have seen them sign as a family, see? So my guess again is that in the sense that Joseph is a star in heaven and has not really died except physically, they are still a family, and he signs with the three souls, three stars. That's my guess. At first, intellectually, I said, no, this isn't Matthew. See, so this is a perfect case of where my intellect said no and my intuition said maybe. This is written for the Portland Transcript. Now, what is the date of this thing? Here it is. This is March 30, 1839. So it's about the same time. Now, why is he using a different pseudonym? Why is he not signing F? He did this. He didn't want to get known as a particular pseudonym. So he was writing excellent work, but he didn't want to get a reputation and for people to start saying, who is this F? So he split himself into these different pseudonyms so that people would think this is really good by F, but we can't find very much else by him. And this is really good by this M******, but we can't find very many of those either. And that way he retained an anonymity. Now, I strongly feel, though I can't prove, there's some evidence for it, that Abby was the biggest driver behind this anonymity business, that she strongly felt that it was virtuous to remain anonymous, that pride of recognition should, above all things, be avoided. But especially for Matthew, I think she knew that he was a little bit on the emotionally immature side and that it would not be good for him. Fame would not be good for him. I think she was psychic. I think she was deeply knowledgeable about psychology before her time, and she could see that he might have trouble handling fame, and it was really important for him to stay anonymous. And I think she made him promise on her deathbed, which is why he did this. It's another reason why he didn't expose himself as the author of The Raven, because he was being true to the promise he made to Abby on her deathbed to remain anonymous. I could be wrong. That's just a gut feeling. This is difficult to read because the copy was not in very good shape, so I'll do my best. I saw one bright autumnal day. I saw one bright autumnal day, meaning in autumn. I don't know how you pronounce it. A beauteous rose unfold, and to a brilliant sun display a bosom decked with gold. It grew upon a thrifty stalk, well sheltered from the breeze that scattered o'er the garden walk withered and yellow leaves. So this is an autumn rose, and what we're talking is Matthew's son. He's using the rose as a metaphor for his late son, I would say, who died in fall of the previous year. I gazed upon that lovely flower with rapturous delight, and thought that in its charms was power to make the dark hour bright. With garnet, pearl, and topaz rare, that brilliant might well vie. Brilliant was a noun back then. 'Twas meet to grace the bosom fair of royal dignity. Now, Abby was from a royal family. See, her father was a marquis, so that's kind of interesting. I wished that long that rose might bloom in all its radiance fair, and by its fragrance shed perfume on the surrounding air. Vain wish, for soon a withering blast fell on its ruddiness. It drooped, and ere the day was past, died in its loveliness. So pass earth's richest gems away, so died the parent's joy. See, he's coming right out and saying it here. That's interesting. Dark clouds obscure the brightest day, and griefs the heart annoy. But there's a balm for souls oppressed. I can't read this line at all. It ends with a Y. A bosom where the head may rest, while tears are wiped away. Thrice happy they who can repose in calm and holy trust on him who wept for others' woes, who raised the sleeping dust, who in a glorious robe of, I can't read that, arrays the blood-bought soul and bids it rest in realms of light while something ages roll. M star star star. This is a deeply spiritual man, a Christian, who has lost a child because he says the parent. So this is Matthew writing about the loss of his son Joseph. This is precious to me because there's very little of this. You will find in the book of poetry that Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, published in 1844 called Poems, you will find a poem called A Child Asleep. In one of the very few email exchanges I did with a professor who was, I think, retired and back in the day had specialized in Elizabeth Barrett Browning, by way of quickly trying to disprove my theory, she told me that this poem had actually been published by Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1840. Well, it had and it hadn't. But that poem basically is about Joseph sleeping and somebody, I'm feeling it was a minister, who probably didn't approve of Abby, because Abby was being persecuted really by the traditional Christians, had come to bless the child. Maybe she was Catholic, so maybe there was a confirmation or something that they were going to do, consecration, whatever you call it. And maybe the priest came and he was going to bless the child. Well, Matthew and Abby together both felt that maybe they didn't like him, but they felt that the child should be blessing him because Joseph, who was an old soul, which they knew, was in the heaven realm as he was sleeping and listening to the angels who were talking to him and singing to him, see? And that if anybody should be blessing anybody, Joseph should be blessing him rather than the other way around. That's what that poem originally was. Elizabeth Barrett Browning has distorted it all to heck and messed with it. And what she's done, if you look at the early version and the later version, in both cases, she has, I believe, taken the original and monkeyed with it. She hasn't written one and then monkeyed with that to make the second version. She has taken the original, monkeyed with it once, and monkeyed with it again 4 years later. I'm going to go get you the original printing. Be right back. Okay, I don't know if I'll be able to keep this wrapper on. This is archival plastic, but it's not the kind normally used for books. It's the kind I could afford that's normally for newspapers, and it doesn't stay on very well. It just protects them for now until somebody starts buying my books and I can actually afford, I think I'll take it off. I can actually afford the right kind of plastic. I live very cheaply in my attic, just the way that Matthew reported in one of his poems. This is Finden's Tableau of 1840. I think I can show this to the camera. This is the illustration. This is like an illustrated table book, very expensive probably. This is for the poem that Matthew had apparently sent. I think that Matthew and Abby had sent that poem to Elizabeth Barrett Browning in 1838 while Joseph was still alive. There's a long story. I'm going to be writing an article about that, so I won't reveal everything. This is what the cover page looks like for Finden's Tableau. I don't know if you pronounce it Tableau or Tableau. Here is the very first poem, is this same one that Matthew and Abby had sent to her. And here she's titling it The Dream. Well, can you see that? Let's see. There we go. Those of you who like to stop the cursor and screen capture or whatever. So there's a quote from Shakespeare, "How like a dream this is I see and hear." I looked up that quote. It's totally inappropriate for the subject matter. So it's not something, if Matthew used a quote, it was always directly on target. So Elizabeth Barrett has picked up something that's totally inappropriate. It just sounds relevant. And then I'll just read a couple of the stanzas. I can pretty much tell which ones were original and which ones she's thrown in here. "How he sleepeth, having drunken weary childhood's mandragore. From his pretty eyes have sunken pleasures to make room for more, sleeping near the withered nosegay, which he pulled a day before." This is Matthew's typical style. The story is Matthew loved to pick flowers. She loved flowers. She would have taken him and gone with him to pick flowers. And at the time that this would have happened, this would have been like spring or summer. He died at 11 months in August, which gives you some idea of when this could have happened. This is about a child who's experiencing the astral realm while he's sleeping as an old soul. "Nosegays, leave them for the waking. Throw them earthwards where they grew. Dim are they beside the breaking amaranths he looks unto. Closed eyes see brighter colors than the open ever do." And then she adds her own stanzas and so on that reveal her complete lack of understanding of what this poem is about. I'm not pussyfooting around when I say, that she could not possibly have written these poems any more than Charles Dickens could possibly have written A Christmas Carol, any more than Edgar Allan Poe could possibly have written The Raven. The problem is that people aren't, as scholars and the public, are not up to speed on mysticism. Because if anybody is up to speed on mysticism, they can tell where these bunglers have stuck their own thumbs into these things and what was original. It's obvious. It's as obvious as if you've got somebody with a beautiful hand and then somebody else that just comes in and scribbles, see, to somebody who understands mysticism and has studied it for 47 years, as I have now. So I can't educate these professors about mysticism. Even there's a few mystics among these professors that I see online, but they're not interested in these things. So there's no point in writing to them. And the ones who have taken up Edgar Allan Poe, for example, they're clueless about mysticism. So you can't teach them the subject about which they're clueless and don't have the capacity to really understand. So they have the letters, they have the alphabet strung out of their name, but that does not make them experts where it counts in this matter. See? So that's one of the M *** pieces. Let's get back into the Kindle and look at the last one. I'm saying that's definitely Matthew at this point, based on what I know about his personal life and his style and so on. But let's look at the second one. And I have not carefully looked through all of these yet. So there may be others. There could be contraindications. But I'm saying that both of these signatures, M *** and F, are both Matthew, written with Abby over his shoulders, sharing these things with her. See, so and possibly in the one case with her actually writing the poetry. So this is precious stuff. I don't have that much that Matthew and Abby wrote together or that Matthew wrote while they were together. To blank on his wedding day. Now, my guess is, I think I've seen this before, and I think I've checked on it and found that this was written right when his friend, Charles Isley, the editor of the paper, had a 16-year-old daughter who was married and moved away to another town. And I think that Matthew wrote it on this occasion, but in any case, it's written to the fellow that married the girl. And he says, to blank on his wedding day. I have read this one through. Go take your bride. For you she leaves the haunts of early days. Warm be the heart that now receives the price her friendship pays. For you, her native hills she flies, with all their purling rills, and far to stranger lands she hies, while hope her bosom fills. The circle where her sunlit brow e'er diffused delight, for you she leaves, quite broken now, and gloomy as the night. For yours she gives a mother's care, for yours a mother's love. Oh, then in every sorrow share, and love as mothers love. Whate'er the treasures you may bring, naught but your love can pay for Charlotte's vow, a priceless thing, giving herself away. Love then when days are bright and clear, love in the twilight hour, love more when aught around looks drear, love most when tempests lower. M ****. Now, Matthew very, very rarely wrote poetry for occasions. John Greenleaf Whittier would do that off and on. But Matthew very rarely wrote upon request. If this is written by Matthew, which I have every reason to believe it was, there would have been some close friend whose daughter was named Charlotte. So there you have it. Those are all confirmed. The bookworm is out. So I actually keyed that in. I'll have to just erase it. And the others are I consider now definite. Very soon I will be getting in the mail the physical copy of the Portland transcript from, I believe it was October, and that has a star-signed piece in it. That's Matthew had used the star in earlier years, as early as 1830, but this is the first time I found that he's used it here in the 1839 transcript. And I can't recall now, as I'm sitting here, what the subject of it is, but it's quite interesting, and I'm going to read it in its entirety when I get it in from the original. But until then, for anybody who has stuck this out, I hope that you see that this is real research. I am not grabbing these things out of the air, making connections of like 2 and 2 equals 5 using magical thinking. This is not magical thinking. This is research based on 11 years of exploring and carefully analyzing over 2,300 works, which I have digitized and which are in a searchable database, becoming intimately familiar with Matthew Frank and Whittier's style and allowing myself to be guided by my own intuition, given that this is my past life writing. And it's grist for the mill, but it's interesting to me that I was fooled by that surprise ending, that the judge turns out to be the culprit and turns himself in that story. Completely fooled by it. And on other occasions, I have kind of had an idea what was coming, but this one completely took me by surprise. Well, like I said, that's grist for the mill. That shows how past life memory sometimes works. I'm not the same person in the sense of having the same physical identity and physical personality. Under normal waking consciousness, I don't have past life memory. I have amnesia. So I literally can enjoy and be surprised by my past life work as though I was reading it for the first time, even though it feels like exactly the way I would have written it. It's hard to explain. That's the way my mind works. But the specifics I may or may not remember, see? So I think part of what's going on there is that was not autobiographical. That was a plot device. There wasn't actually one of Matthew's friends who had betrayed him. Matthew was not really a lawyer. He did not really become a judge. So all of that was made up as a fictional plot. So there wasn't anything autobiographical that was prompting me to remember what was going on. Where these things are autobiographical, I'm much more likely to remember them and to be able to predict what's going to happen. In this case, it was not. So I think that it just goes to this issue that Matthew and Abby struggled with, that if you knew everything about me or if something happened that it looked like I was a bad person, would you still believe in me? Now, personally, I'm going through this right now with Andrew Cuomo because I was very strongly and favorably impressed by Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York City, the way that he gave his press conferences and handled the COVID-19 pandemic in New York City. I really liked everything he was doing. I liked his attitude. I liked what I saw as his ethics and his integrity and his emphasis on facts. The whole, way he described his relationship with his daughters and his family. I really liked everything about it. And when the charges about nursing home deaths came up, I felt that was just like a witch hunt. But with 6 young women coming forward to claim that he acted inappropriately, including things like groping and forcibly kissing and things like that, and then claiming that he never touched anybody inappropriately, well, either he's telling the truth and all of these people are lying, or else he's lying, which would make him a huge hypocrite. And I don't know what to do with it. I suspect it's somebody who has a self-image that just he wasn't walking the walk. He had this self-image and he believed in certain things, but he wasn't walking the walk. And now he's, become a hypocrite. That's my guess. Either that or somebody's really out to get him and they've paid these girls to lie, which is possible. Because whoever's behind the smear tactics has serious money, is my guess. Serious money. Very powerful people want him out because he's a real contender for the next presidential election and they want to remove him as a contender, see? So either way, I think that's the case. I think they couldn't make the nursing home thing stick, so they found dirt on him through these girls, and now they're going to bring him down with that. And it may be true, but nonetheless, somebody's trying to take him down. Well, anyway, that's the same kind of thing that Matthew and Abby were struggling with. What would happen if I got arrested? What would happen if somebody started charging me with things? Well, they'd already been through it, as I told you, when Abby was charged with witchcraft and Matthew stood by her. I don't know if it happened the other way around or not, but I think that's kind of the issue that they were writing about. Anyway, that's how I do my research. And again, I have not been trained. This is all on-the-job training, but it's real, rigorous scholarship. And when I come out with something that sounds like I'm deluded, like in my past life, I wrote The Raven. The same scholarship is going into that. When I say that Matthew and Abby were the original authors of A Christmas Carol, and I can prove it to a very high standard, the same scholarship is going into that. So you will shortly see that scholarship, if you care to, in my article about Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, which is scheduled supposedly to be released in Real Paranormal Magazine UK, the e-zine, tomorrow, Monday, the 15th. And then a month from then, it goes into Academia EDU and my page on Academia EDU, which is easily found. And then I start writing personalized emails to over 300 professors in the United States, Canada, the UK, and Australia, all the English-speaking countries I can find, giving them the link to Academia EDU, briefly describing what it is, and inviting them to give me their comments. I'm anticipating that no more than 1% will actually read it and respond. I don't know how many will read it, but I'm anticipating that only 1% or so will respond. Those will respond in a patronizing way without accepting anything that I've said. And there the matter will sit. But the soup has been spit in. They have been put on notice. They have seen it. And the article is excellent. It's one of the best things I've ever written. It's very well researched. It's like the research I'm doing here, but with bells on. And I'm not wrong. So, I mean, this is big. This is big, this is big news. And why am I being ignored to the point that, I have to wash my own laundry in the sink and cut my own hair and eat the cheapest and yet healthiest food that I possibly can over and over and over, the same thing every day for lunch and dinner, basically, to try to save enough money to keep my savings from going down too fast. Why do I have to do that when I'm sitting on a discovery like this? I think it's kind of interesting. A few of these professors I'm writing to are in journalism. They're still active journalists. So that's another place to go with this, is to start writing journalists. And it's very hard to find contact information for journalists, but I have discovered you can do it through the universities where they're teaching. See? So I can go back through these schools and go through the journalism programs and start writing those professors. I may do that at some future time. I always think of one more thing that I can do, to make sure no stone is unturned. So that might be for the future, to go for the journalists and see if I can get them. There was one journalist I had online who was going to possibly publish something. She wanted it shorter and shorter and shorter. And she said, you're not going to be happy with the way that I present this. In other words, she's telling me up front that she was going to be skeptical and make a mockery of it, make me look like a fool. So, but in a sense, any publicity is better than no publicity. On the other hand, Jesus said not to cast your pearls before swine. And with no intention to call professors swine, as a principle, I'm doing a lot of that. I'm casting a lot of my pearls before swine, even with these entries. And it makes me very uncomfortable, especially when it comes to Abby. I'm pretty careful about that. Even so, I have to put some of her poetry out there to a general audience, and I don't like it, because I don't want her mocked. Definitely, I can be mocked. I don't care. It bothers me, but I'm pretty much used to it, because after 11 years of research with evidence like what I have today, I know I'm right. It's beyond question. This is my hand, and I'm right about these attributions. I'm not guessing. I'm not wrong. That's not the issue, whether I'm right or not. Where I'm not sure, I say so. But where I'm sure, it's done deal. It's done. Reincarnation is done. That I'm Matthew Franklin Whittier is a done deal, reincarnated. That Matthew and Abby were the original authors of A Christmas Carol. That Matthew was the original author of The Raven. That these poems published by Elizabeth Barrett, before she was Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that those were Matthew's and possibly one by Abby. That's done. That these star-signed pieces claimed for Margaret Fuller and the F-signed ones in the dial, that those were actually Matthew's. That's a done deal. I don't come forth with these things publicly until I'm sure, So why isn't this news? Why isn't somebody buying my books? Why isn't somebody asking me to speak for their class, or to be a guest in their class? Why am I not getting invited to podcasts and to speak at conferences? It's because nobody for half a second, takes me seriously. But here's the thing, I've said this many times, it's just a step away. It's just a turn. The instant you turn this thing and start taking me seriously, the whole thing explodes, And then I have my friend Jeff Keen saying, well, nobody's going to care. Nobody will care. Bless his heart. I shouldn't keep mentioning that. I just don't think he understands how big this is, So there you have it. There's another entry. I've got the rest of the day to edit this. I'm going to put in, images of these things that I've talked about, and I'll talk to you on another day.